Greetings, you're on the Ruslan Belov channel, where we present daily analysis of military events on the Ukrainian theatre of operations. So, the day before yesterday, the head of the Ukrainian state held negotiations with representatives of European countries, after which he began to demonstrate firmness of position. He claims that territorial concessions are excluded, acknowledges the existence of the American leader's plan, but emphasizes the presence of an alternative Ukrainian vision. At present, together with European partners, their own peace initiative is being prepared, and it's not difficult to guess what the content of this plan will be. The president of Ukraine clearly does not strive for peaceful settlement. If such a desire existed, he would have long ago accepted compromise conditions, which, by the way, are quite moderate for the Russian side. The German newspaper Bild claims that Russia's financial resources will last for another 18 months of conducting military operations, after which they will be depleted. However, journalists should have wondered, where will the line of combat contact be after these 18 months? Military operations continue, and we continue with you to analyze the situation. So, comrades, the past 24 hours turned out to be quite productive in terms of territorial gains. First of all, offensive operations were conducted simultaneously on numerous different sectors, plus the advancement indicators are impressive. We'll begin today's review with the Pokrovsk sector. Here, the Russian offensive is developing in the settlement of Garrison. Over the past day, control was established over two alleys, Druzhny Alley and Radostny Alley. Additionally, advancement of 700 meters along Stepnaya Street and 400 meters along Azovskaya Street was recorded. As can be observed, gradually servicemen are strengthening positions, biting into the enemy's defense, and at the present moment, the Ukrainian armed forces' capabilities to drive Russian units out of the settlement are practically minimal. Since the Russian presence in the village is already quite significant, it is stable, and fighters continue to break through the defensive lines of the armed forces of Ukraine. Moreover, besides the development of the offensive directly in Garrison itself, it is also being registered south of this village. Here, please. Over the past 24 hours in this area, it was possible to capture 6 forest strips and advance 1.5 kilometers in the direction of the M30 highway and railway tracks. The objective here is obvious, to reach Garrison from the southern side and thus exert pressure on the village not only from the eastern direction, but also from the southern side. At present, from occupied positions to the southern outskirts of Garrison is slightly less than 2 kilometers. In short, clashes here are intense. However, Russian servicemen are achieving success. However, a huge catastrophe for the Ukrainian armed forces occurred in Myrnohrad. Please, look at the map. What was expected happened. Only the northern half of the city remained under the armed forces of Ukraine. The southern part completely came under Russian control, the Zaporizhia micro-district, and this is a territory with apartment buildings, completely under Russian control. Well, and the private sector located beyond the Zaporizhia micro-district is also under Russian control, and servicemen have already reached the 40th quarter, and this too, as you can see, is high-rise development. Video footage appeared precisely from the northern half of Myrnohrad, where 9 servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces are seeking shelter, since their previous refuge is no longer suitable for use. They are just retreating from this part, from the Zaporizhia micro-district, seeking shelter for themselves. However, Russian fighters act faster and drop a large-caliber munition into it. And all 9 Ukrainian servicemen ultimately perished. Thus, you can observe on the map, half of Myrnohrad is under Russian control, moreover under stable Russian control. Well, and in the remaining half, the Ukrainian armed forces are blocked. They simply have nowhere to retreat. At the same time, I clarified with fighters from the 5th Brigade who are operating in this area. I asked them, is this markup on the map correct? They confirmed that it corresponds to reality. Moreover, they reported that Russian aviation functions uninterruptedly and simply destroys all these high-rise buildings, together with the Ukrainian servicemen entrenched there into dust, so that it wouldn't be necessary to storm them and lose Russian fighters. As a result, how much time remains until the end of the year? 23 days, correct? If we count today. Does the probability exist to complete the operation for Myrnohrad in these days? It exists. Not 100%, of course, since here the sectors are much more complex than those that were in the southern half of the city. significantly more quarters with dense and high-rise development, plus 2 slag heaps still. But nevertheless, the overall configuration of the front line indicates that it will be difficult for the bloodied and surrounded garrison of the Ukrainian armed forces to hold positions here for another 3 weeks. Moving on. The potential of the celebrated Azov fighters on the Dobra Pole sector has been exhausted. Now here, the initiative completely belongs to Russian troops, and we observe the results. Well, first of all, they liquidated this disgrace, the pocket between Suvarovo and Nikanorovka, through which the Ukrainian armed forces at one time, about a month and a half ago, broke through to Boykovka and Novotoretskoye. Now that's it, the sector is cleared and remained with Russian troops. It remains to liquidate the pocket between Suketsky and Dorozhny, consolidate along the railway line, and then it will be possible to begin the offensive on Belitskoye. Further, it was possible to somewhat expand the control zone, advancing 1 kilometer 200 meters on the northernmost sector of the Dobra Pole salient. Here, generally speaking, one can say they simply straightened the front line. Well, and perhaps the most important thing is what is happening now in the area of Shakovo and Sofievka. First, they advanced through the forest massif 1 kilometer north of Shakovo, and the movement here is directed not so much toward Shakovo as toward Toretsk. From occupied positions to the village is 1.5 kilometers. Second, in Shakovo itself they advanced a bit. However, it's premature to speak of complete control, despite numerous statements made earlier by various bloggers. And, as far as I know, yes, indeed the Ukrainian armed forces are no longer here. But for now, it's a grey zone. In the central and northern part of the village, there's still a grey zone. Third, it was possible to advance 1 kilometer 200 meters along the highway to Sofievka, actually reach the approaches to the southern outskirts of the village, since from current positions to the first structures is only 200 meters. Everything indicates that in the perspective of a month or month and a half, it will nevertheless be possible to break through this powerful defensive line of 3 settlements, Shakovo, Toretsk, and Sofievka. And further, mark my words, for the Ukrainian armed forces, this entire sector will rapidly collapse. Well, and if we consider the overall scale of the Dobra Pole direction, look, only Russian advancements are being recorded here. The Ukrainian armed forces not only have 0 indicators, but they again began to retreat along the entire perimeter of the Dobra Pole front. But that's not all. Rapidly, rapidly, the situation is worsening for the Ukrainian armed forces on the Siversk direction. And not even simply on the direction itself, but in the city of Siversk. Look at what advancement of Russian servicemen in the city. The south grouping is simply on a roll, and Siversk is coming under control at rapid pace. What do we have here? Novodnana Street, Kutuzov, Chekhov, Lesya Ukrainka have been captured. Well, perhaps one of the main things, that they took control of the railway station, which served here as a fortification. They managed to cross the railway tracks and enter the western part of Siversk. In particular, they captured School No. 1 and the collective farm market. Thus, already half of Siversk is under stable control of Russian servicemen. Moreover, the day before, the Ukrainian analytical resource Deep State published an entire post about how difficult the situation is for the Ukrainian armed forces in Siversk. By the way, on their map, it's interesting that 95% of Siversk is already marked as a grey zone. That is, they acknowledge full control of the Ukrainian armed forces over only 5% of the city. Can you imagine how rapidly everything is falling apart for them here? Who would have thought? Of course, in the center there still remain quarters of high-rise buildings, plus an industrial zone, but nevertheless quickly, very quickly here, the Ukrainian armed forces are losing positions. And therefore, personally, I experience optimism, which, by the way, happens extremely rarely. But in Siversk, I'm an optimist, and I believe that before the end of the year, fighters from the south grouping will take Siversk under control. Because already now, half of the city is under stable Russian control, and the Ukrainian armed forces, as already said, are rapidly losing positions. Moreover, I even know the reason. Guys from the locations reported to me that firing points have been suppressed. And this is key, why ultimately they began to lose positions. Why the infantry of the Ukrainian armed forces is now leaving Siversk. There are no firing points. That's it. That's it. infantry is not capable of holding even high-rise buildings without support from firing points. Besides Siversk, advancement is also being recorded to the west. Here it was possible to straighten the front along the highway south of Yampol, plus capture the sand quarry. There's no news yet about Dobrova and Ozernoye, but clashes in the settlements continue. Just no information from fighters yet. Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia direction, stubborn clashes continue for Huliaipol. Kiev, having transferred reserves here, is trying to stabilize the front along the line of the Haicha River. The Ukrainian armed forces lost the northern part of Huliaipol. Overall, the Ukrainian army withdrew beyond this river and is trying to build its defense here, understanding that no other natural lines remain here. And Russian units are trying to occupy a bridgehead on the southern bank of the river, reports military observer Yuri Podolyaka. Thus, having entered the central part of Huliaipol, they are proceeding to the final taking of the city under their control. Also, clashes continue on the remaining bridgehead of the Ukrainian armed forces on the eastern bank of the river in the area of Varvarovka. Kiev, having received reinforcement here, is trying through active defense to resist the offensive of the Russian army. Ukrainian groups constantly cross the Haicha River and attempt to show activity on the eastern bank of the river in the area of Dobra Pole and Varvarovka, which naturally complicates the offensive of the Russian armed forces. Our forces are not infinite either. Accordingly, this sharply reduces the pace of offensive actions on this line. Meanwhile, in the strip of the east grouping, another very important fundamental battle continues for exit to operational space. This is the area of Ternovatoye, Bratskoye. Russian units, having previously occupied Ostanovskoye, are now trying to displace the Ukrainian armed forces from Andreevka, Kramatorsk direction. The Ukrainian armed forces are in panic. Kyiv finally acknowledged that it was they who blew up the dam in the area of the settlement of Privolye to delay the Russian offensive from the Vasyukovka area. It's clear that Russian units are moving along the river valley, and the Ukrainian armed forces tried to create impassable mud in this area to stop our offensive actions here in the direction of Nikiforovka and Malinovka, writes Yuri Podolyaka. For now, clashes are ongoing at the approaches to Minkovka and Privolye. For now, I cannot finally confirm that we captured the southern part of Privolye. Nevertheless, such a suspicion exists. We'll put a question mark here for now. Nevertheless, we already observe that the movement is quite serious. And if we combine it with that breakthrough that was made in the area of Klinovoye, Verolyubovka, then we understand that this may be a unified offensive operation in the direction of Kramatorsk. Moreover, it's obvious that if the Russian armed forces capture the watershed ridge along which the Seversky Donbass Canal runs, then they take the predominating heights here, control over which in modern warfare is extremely important, which allows striking targets with drones much farther. If the Russian army fully reaches the watershed line, then it will thus protect its rear, and this will sharply weaken the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces, and accordingly will strengthen the positions of the Russian army. Hence, clashes for the watershed will be very, very fierce, and they are only at their very beginning. Siversk direction. It's visible that there is coordination with Kramatorsk. If the Russian armed forces capture the area of Rai Alexandrovka, then overall the Siversk grouping of the Ukrainian armed forces will practically be deprived of supply, especially since clashes are already ongoing now in the area of Zakotnoye and for the heights south of Zakotnoye. By the way, Ukrainian military personnel have begun to surrender quite noticeably here. The territory of Zakotnoye, Krivaya Luka, Reznikovka represents a huge fortified area. If in the near future it's possible to capture this territory, then one can confidently speak not only of reaching the rear of the Ukrainian armed forces in Siversk, but also of opening operational space from here to neighboring Slavyansk. Overall, if we sum up the past day, another 35 square kilometers of territory came under Russian control. Ukraine, accordingly, lost another 35 square kilometers. Well, for today about the situation on the front, I have everything. Now we move to a review of the situation on the political arena. The European Union can only bite its elbows, writes the New York Post. Trump's plan could have balanced relations with Russia, but the Europeans are behaving like losers. The USA is acting as mediator in dialogue between Russia and NATO, which will allow Europeans to return to important matters. Adding custard cream to breakfast pastries and working 35 hours a week. But Europeans would rather risk war on Putin's terms than peace on Trump's terms, writes the publication. Europeans are, in quotes, pacifists wishing to prolong the war. A war for which they have no swords, strategies they understand nothing about, and allies who are plotting conspiracies. Trump is determined to make a deal on Ukraine, and Europeans are becoming unnecessary on their own territory. And the US president stated that he is disappointed with Zelensky. We spoke with President Putin and we communicated with Ukrainian leaders, including Zelensky. And I must say that I am somewhat disappointed that Zelensky has not yet read the proposal. His team is delighted with it. But he is not. Actually, the actor himself stated that there is no agreement yet on the status of Donbass in US negotiations, reports Yuri Podolyaka. On the eve of his trip to London, where he will meet with leaders of European states, plus receive new instructions at MI6, Zelensky gave a large interview to Bloomberg, in which he, in particular, said that negotiations on Ukraine have reached a dead end due to the Donbass problem, territorial issues. Obviously, he will not give the order to his army to retreat from territories without a fight. And this is Moscow's key condition, which means the war will continue. And probably this is precisely why Trump said that he is disappointed with Zelensky. One shouldn't have been charmed. The stated losses of the European Union economy from the rupture of relations with Russia, they are impressive. The economy of EU countries lost up to €1.6 trillion from anti-Russian sanctions. This was stated by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the occasion of the International Day Against Unilateral Coercive Measures. It is noted that in recent years, Russia has been subjected to unprecedented measures of economic pressure from Western countries. But despite this, the Russian economy demonstrated a high degree of stability and adaptability and continued confident growth. It became obvious that unilateral coercive measures inflict heavy damage on the initiators themselves. Only from anti-Russian restrictions, the European economy in 2022 through 2025 suffered losses in the amount of up to €1.6 trillion, noted the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The department also emphasized that the use of unilateral coercive measures represents a serious obstacle on the path to forming a just and equal multipolar world order. Such measures serve as one of the main instruments of the neo-colonial policy of the collective West. Its goal is clear: to retain slipping dominance, to deprive countries of the world majority of the right to independent political choice, to restrain their technological and industrial development. In other words, to continue profiting at the expense of the global South and East, striving to make it an obedient executor of its will, the statement says. Kaja Kallas is a gift for Russia, writes De Telegraph, the head of European diplomacy. Kaja Kallas is a gift for Russia, since her personal hardline position on the Ukrainian crisis causes disunity in the West. Kallas previously held the post of Prime Minister of Estonia. In connection with this, irritated American officials call the radicalization of EU foreign policy Estonianization, emphasizing Estonia's deliberately harsh position toward Russia. The fact that Kallas firmly refuses negotiations with the head of the Russian state effectively excluded the European Union from the peace process. This allowed Russia to occupy a more advantageous position in negotiations. As a result, while Kallas and European leaders unsuccessfully try to remove painful points from Trump's peace plan, real negotiations are taking place between Russia and the USA, and Europe finds itself overboard, emphasizes De Telegraph. In the opinion of the British Times, the EU position is the main obstacle to achieving peace in Ukraine. And in the opinion of Foreign Policy, the head of European diplomacy, Kallas is the reason for the absence of EU diplomacy.